Hello and welcome to Other Voices, brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm your host, Paul George. We're recording this program on Tuesday, August 7th, and as is usually the case, early morning, Donald Trump was on Twitter letting the world know what he was thinking about. This morning he had this to tweet. The Iran sanctions have officially been cast. These are the most biting sanctions ever imposed, and in November, they ratchet up to yet another level. Anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States. I am asking for world peace, all in caps, of course, nothing less. End of tweet from Donald Trump. And that's going to be our topic on this edition of Other Voices, what's happening with Iran, with the sanctions, the end of the nuclear accord. We're also going to get an update on what's happening in Syria and where that may go in the wake of the Putin-Trump summit in Helsinki just recently. And joining us once again, I'm very pleased to be joined by foreign correspondent Reese Erlich. Reese, welcome back to Other Voices.
Thank you so much.
So many times here, and I always appreciate your insights. Just quickly, Reese Erlich's history in journalism goes back over 40 years. He started at as a staff writer and research editor for Ramparts magazine. Today he works as a full-time print and broadcast freelance reporter. He reports regularly for National Public Radio, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and Radio Deutsche Welle, a German station. His articles appear in Vice News and Foreign Policy. His television documentaries have aired on PBS stations nationwide, and his nationally syndicated column, called Foreign Correspondent, appears every 2 weeks in a number of publications around the country. He's also the author of numerous books, but let me mention just a few that are germane to tonight's topic. Back in 2010, I think it was Conversations with Terrorists, which includes an interview with Bashar al-Assad. And then in 2016, was it Inside Syria, the backstory of their civil war. And somewhere in between those, he published the Iran Agenda, which is soon to be, it has been revised and about to be reissued.
In September.
In September. And Reese will be back in Los Altos, actually, hosted by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center in early November with the new one. What's the title of the?
The full title is The Iran Agenda Today.
Today.
The real story inside Iran and what's wrong with U.S. policy.
Okay, so we'll be looking for that in September, and we'll be looking for you to come back with the book in November here locally for a talk at the Los Altos Library. So let's start with a quick review of what the nuclear accord with Iran had accomplished that Trump has just thrown away, and what is he after now?
Well, after years of complaining that Iran was capable of developing a nuclear weapon, the Obama administration sat down and engaged in very tough bargaining with the administration in Tehran. And the Iranians actually made a huge number of concessions. It's something that's not talked a lot about in the US media, or certainly not out of Washington. But the Iranians agreed to ship almost all of their fissionable material, their enriched uranium, out of the country. They agreed to the most intrusive...
It went to Russia, right?
Yeah. They agreed to the most intrusive inspections in the history of the world, according to the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency.
And he should know.
And he should know. He's the guy in charge of them. The IAEA can inspect from the point of the mining the uranium to the refining it, to the enrichment, to the use in the power stations, to the use of the disposal of the waste. So none of it's going to be able to be diverted. The IAEA has the right to demand inspections anywhere in Iran if they have evidence that there's some kind of illegal nuclear activity going on. So it's everything that the U.S. almost everything the U.S. had wanted in years and years of complaining about Iran. They got it.
Yeah.
And the second point is that this was not simply an agreement between the U.S. and Iran. This was an agreement between 7 countries. In addition to those two, we had Britain, France, Germany, China, and Russia. They went to the United Nations Security Council and passed a resolution. It's now part of international law.
That's
Again,
right.
It's not just an agreement between the U.S. and Iran. And the Iranians, and in return, were supposed to receive relief from sanctions that were passed as a result of the nuclear issue. And while it didn't go as fast as they wanted, there started to be, particularly from European countries, commitments to develop natural gas by a French oil company, restore auto manufacturing with a French company. Boeing was interested in selling airplanes. There was some indications.
Boeing made a deal, did they not?
Well, they had an agreement in principle. They didn't have a signed contract because even under Obama, it wasn't clear that they were going to be able to actually make the deal go through. And then once Trump came in, forget about it. It was gone. So there had been some progress, not as much as the Iranians wanted, but there had been some progress economically. Trump comes in and says, forget about it. I don't like it. I campaigned against it, therefore I can do, and the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world, so we're going to just cancel it. And it took a while, and there were various things along the way, but as we speak today, they've canceled it, and they're now reimposing the sanctions unilaterally that they would have imposed if Iran had broken the deal. Now remember, according to everybody, including the IAEA, Iran has still, to this day, lived up to their end of the bargain on the nuclear accord. It's the U.S. and the Trump administration that is breaking it. Now imagine if the situation were reversed, if Iran had agreed to the nuclear accord and then just a new administration got elected and they said, well, forget about it. We're going to now proceed to develop a nuclear weapon. What would the reaction of the United States been? I mean, goodness. Yeah. And we know what they would have tried invading them or bombing them or whatever, or they would have imposed harsh sanctions. Well, now Iran is living up to the deal, and they're still imposing harsh sanctions.
Yeah. So I hate to do this, but I need to take a technical time out here and ask our audio person to bring the studio speaker down a bit. It's a little bit too loud and rattling around in here. So when Trump announced his pulling out, he had been talking about this, but back in May when he officially pulled us out, his complaint about the JCPOA, is this Joint Powers Agreement is referred to, he said it didn't address enough. It only addressed the nuclear weapons issue, and that Iran has missiles he's talked about. He wants to negotiate getting rid of Iran's missiles. But there's been a lot of nebulous talk, too, with words like Iran meddling in the region, destabilizing the region, acting aggressively, exporting terrorism. Mm-hmm. Now, we know Iran is not the friendliest country in the world, but...
Yeah, they're doing a lot of evil things in the Middle East. And I've made it very clear in my books, and when I go to Iran, when I interview officials over there, I make it very clear what they're doing is wrong. They seek to be a hegemonic power within the region, not in the world like the United States, but within the region, and they're spread their particular ideology and their interpretation of Shia Islam to various countries of the region. But anybody who knows anything about how you negotiate arms treaties, you don't bring in all the disagreements that you have. Mm-hmm. I mean, if the Iranians, wanted to bring in issues, they could say, well, we're not going to reach a nuclear agreement until the U.S. police stop killing African Americans and all the human rights violations that go on in the U.S. We're not going to do it until you get all your troops out of Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq, because you're meddling in the affairs of those countries. Right. Well, of course, then nobody would have gotten anywhere. There was zero chance of a negotiated agreement. And of course, even back in the days of the Soviet Union and the U.S., when they negotiated successfully arms control treaties, they set aside all the other disagreements they had on human rights.
Huge list.
And the list of things that they hated each other about, but they could agree on reducing nuclear arms. Well, that's exactly what happened with the nuclear accord between the 7 countries that we just talked about.
So let's talk about the sanctions that are going back on as of today as we record this, and again, August 7th. What's involved in this first round of sanctions, and then we'll talk about what's coming down the road.
Right, exactly. This is the first round of sanctions. It includes stopping of shipments of new airplanes. The day before the sanctions took effect, a company, it's a joint French-Italian airplane company, shipped 5 planes that are going to be used for local civilian air traffic.
You got them in there the day before.
They got in the day before. A few Airbus planes had been delivered in months past. But their civilian airliner system really needs revamping. They've, for all intents and purposes, haven't been able to buy new planes since 1979.
Or parts, I guess.
Yeah, they're scrounge. There's a lot of airplane accidents in Iran because the fleet is old and they're limited as to what they can get. There were limitations on trading gold and currencies, foreign currencies, a number of items, the most serious of which will be in November when the sanctions on selling of oil and the banking sanctions will be imposed. So this is kind of like a partial imposition of sanctions with a warning that more is coming in November.
And now you did mention that these are unilateral sanctions.
Yes.
Europe, Russia, China and Iran have all vowed to stay with the agreement.
Yes.
But in his tweet this morning, and this has been talked about outside of his tweets, he says anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States. So he's talking about secondary sanctions against our allies if they dare do any business with Iran.
Yeah, that's the threat. Now we'll see if he carries it out, and we'll see what the reaction in Europe is. The reaction has been quite interesting. The Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese really want to keep the agreement because they realize what a beneficial, stabilizing force that is for the entire region. If the agreement is canceled, Iran would be free to develop nuclear weapons tomorrow if it wanted to do that. Now they said they won't, but they'd be free to do so. The Europeans have threatened a number of steps on their own. Back when the U.S. was imposing unilateral sanctions on Cuba, remember the embargo against Cuba, the Europeans actually passed laws that would allow European governments to carry out sanctions against European companies that went back on deals with Cuba. It was never implemented because the U.S. never implemented that part of the Helms-Burton law.
It got resolved ahead of time.
Yeah, the presidents kept deferring that because they realized how explosive that was back in the days when we actually thought Europeans were our allies.
Yeah.
Just want to make that clear. So they have this law, and basically they could take steps to counteract the Trump policies by sanctioning American companies and the American government for what it's doing. They could do that.
Yeah.
The likelihood of that happening
in the midst of a tariff war already.
In the midst, right, and the U.S. is the largest economy in the world, and they can cause a lot of damage against the European companies. So the European companies that had agreed to invest in Iran have basically, many of them, not all, but many of them have backed out because they weigh, well, where do we make more profit, Iran or the United States?
Yeah.
Well, there's no question.
We know how that question's going to get answered.
What's really interesting is that China is going to adopt an interesting policy, or at least it's been reported that they're considering it. What they're going to do is they're going to set up a bank or take a bank that has absolutely no relations with the United States. And they're going to make that where all the deals with Iran go through. So all the funds transfers, the payment for oil, holding of accounts, will be in a bank that the U.S. has no control over and no ability to sanction. And the Chinese are going, yeah, you're going to engage in a trade war with us? Well, it has consequences, buddy.
Didn't the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, suggest something like that for Europe as well?
Yes, the Europeans were capable of doing that if they wanted to.
And the reason for this is because in addition to the economic clout of the United States, the world's finances pass through New York and run the risk of being grabbed.
Yeah, exactly. And the U.S. has imposed very severe sanctions on various European banks to the tune of billions of dollars, claiming that they violated sanctions of one kind or another, and they had to pay up. So it is a very serious war that's been going on for a while, even before it predates the trade war. This goes back under Democrats and Republicans, particularly under Obama, when these sanctions were imposed. And the one that was the most damaging, and I was in Iran when this was going on, was the SWIFT banking system. There's what's supposed to be a value-neutral system located in Belgium that takes care of all the wire transfers and accounts
Yeah, it's
of
all this
international
money
banks.
that's moving
It's supposed to be
electronically.
a bank over here needs money and it transfers money from another bank over here. It's supposed to be a neutral, efficient, capitalist process. Well, the U.S. figured out a way to force the SWIFT banking system to go against Iran. And Iran was unable to transfer money. So they could sell their oil, but they couldn't get the money back. And that was a huge blow. And if that in November that's imposed again, it's a big problem. I interviewed businessmen in Iran who, in order to buy foreign parts for their companies, they would literally take suitcases full of cash on an airplane to Dubai. And they deposited it in a bank or with a money changer in Dubai. And then the whole process, when they made profits from selling stuff abroad, they had to reverse it and bring the money back in.
In cash.
In cash in some cases.
Jeez. So yesterday, a number of, on an off-the-record background kind of briefing, there was a telephone call from the White House with several high-ranking officials talking about the sanctions coming back on, why they wouldn't allow themselves to be identified when they're talking with the media is a question for another show. But they were all kind of making the point that A, the U.S. is not seeking regime change, but B, they're hoping that the people of Iran will be so hurt by these sanctions that they'll rise up against the Iranian regime. Which brings up the whole question of what is the actual effect on average people in Iran of these sanctions?
Well, first of all, the U.S. policy, I would characterize it as, yeah, right, We're not for regime change, but we'll welcome it if it happens to come. The U.S. and Pompeo, our Secretary of State, have raised the bar so high in terms of what they would require Iran to do in order to cancel the sanctions that it's impossible. No government in Iran could do it. They want not just changes in the nuclear accord, they want all their trade and investments and military actions in the region pulled back. They want the change in human rights and suddenly to become a human rights observing nation. I mean, it's just absurd. So by
complete dismantlement of the missile
exactly.
force.
Things that are perfectly legal under both international law and agreements that the United States has signed with Iran.
And probably there's a demand on the table for a Trump Tower Tehran.
God, the thought. Anyway, Trump towers are bad enough in the United States. Yes, so you asked the question about the impact on ordinary people.
Yeah.
There have already been some impact. We've seen the value of the rial, the currency in Iran, has gone down. At one point, it was as low as 80% devalued. It's come back a little bit since then. But when I was there less than a year ago, it was 43,000 rials was $1. Now it's somewhere up of 80,000 rials to the dollar.
Jeez.
So imagine if you went into your bank account in the United States and one day you had $100, suddenly you go in the next day and you've got $50.
Yeah.
Imagine what that has, what the impact that would have.
The buying power.
Yeah, the buying power, because a lot of goods are imported into Iran, including medicine, some food, even some gasoline. Even though it's an oil-producing country, the oil is refined elsewhere. So it's a huge, potentially a huge blow. Now, the Iranian government says, don't worry, we've got it under control. We're going to have a resistance economy where we will have domestic industries producing the things that we normally would have imported from abroad. No reason to panic. They're taking steps to try to stabilize the rial. We'll see what actually happens, but the sanctions do have a negative impact for sure on ordinary people.
Yeah, and that's clear in administration statements. They know that it's not collateral damage. It's part of the plan.
Yes,
is to hurt the ordinary people. I do want to get to Syria because that's really complex. But where do we go from here? Is Iran just going to try to? I've read that they're prepared to go into their cash reserves and just try to ride this out until the 2020 elections, in which case they'll probably be meddling in our elections to help elect whoever is.
Elect Ali, your candidate. Oh,
Yes.
whoops.
And can they
By
do
the
that?
way, as far as I know, Iran has not meddled in the U.S.
No.
elections. That was a joke, folks.
Yes.
All right. Yes, there is, and I did a fair amount of interviewing on my last trip to Iran. There's different points of view within the ruling elite in Iran. Some, often called the reformists, want to see essentially what you said: tough it out, not pull out of the agreement, which would give the U.S. an excuse to even carry out more actions. Try to work with the Europeans and certainly the Russians and the Chinese to kind of form a united front against the U.S. and to actually force the U.S. to split even more from Europe. The hardliners, or what are called the principalists, because they uphold the principles of the Iranian Revolution, want a tougher line. They want to see stepping up of enrichment of uranium. Still within the limits of the agreement, but for example, you can enrich up to 80% of your uranium in order to say you're going to develop a nuclear submarine. A nuclear-powered submarine needs a higher level of enrichment than a nuclear power plant, which is somewhere around 3%. And you're allowed to do that. So enrichment for a nuclear power facility is maybe 3.5%. Of nuclear submarine, I forget, it's 60, 70, 80%, something much higher. And of course, so it's a way of thumbing your nose at what the U.S. did. And Ahmadinejad did a lot of that when he was president in Iran. They did a lot. They increased the number of centrifuges. They took other steps that got the U.S. very worried. So the hardliners want to take go right up to the line of what would be legal without violating.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see what what tactics they develop, but yeah, they're depending. They, like people all over the world, are really relying on the American people to come to their senses. You know, a lot of Iranians, whenever I interviewed them, they inevitably ask me, "Why did the American people? Why did you vote for Trump?" I said, that's a question a lot of Americans are asking, and I think the answer is they ain't going to be voting for him or his candidates in the future.
Yeah, when we go into that voting booth in November of 2020, the weight of the world is going to be on our shoulders, I think, if he's a candidate then. So, status quo is the Trump administration, I guess, is satisfied to starve the Iranian people and just wait and see what happens.
And the Iranians responding by not going for it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to a much simpler topic, Syria. And I'm sure Putin and Trump talked about this, but let's start here to get into Syria because it is so complex. But it does seem to be entering some kind of new phase, I think. But there are 5 countries right now with troops in Syria. Syria, of course, but Russia, the United States, Iran, and Turkey, and then there's dozens of little militias and various
You
groups.
can actually also count Israel, because Israel occupies the Golan, which is Syrian territory, and of course they have troops.
So that's officially, you're right, that's a good point. What I was going to say about Israel is that while these troops are on the ground, Israel has bombed some 100+ times since the, mostly Iranian forces, but
also claiming they're going after Hezbollah as well.
Yeah. What is the status of what started out as an Arab Spring uprising, became a bloody, awful civil war, which seems to be entering an endgame with Bashar al-Assad in control of his country?
Well, it's certainly gone more in that direction than the last time we talked a year ago. The most recently, Assad, along with his allies Iran and Russia, have troops that have gone into southern Syria, near the Jordanian border, and also over towards the Israeli border. And they basically gone after the rebel troops that had controlled those areas, and they've retaken the city of Daraa, for example, which is the city. I visited that early on, and that was where the uprising began, with mass peaceful demonstrations. The north of the country, in the Kurdish region and dipping down into the northeast, is where the U.S. has its troops and the Kurdish forces of the PYD, the radical Kurdish forces control. Turkey also has a military base and its troops up in that area. And then there's one province, Idlib, in the northwest, where the rebels still control, and this is where every time there's one of these accords, and the buses come to take the guerrillas or their supporters away, they go to Idlib. But it's become a increasingly smaller and smaller area. So the real question is, will the U.S. keep its troops in Syria in an effort to permanently divide the country, or at least for the foreseeable future? Because as long as the U.S. troops are there, Assad and the Russians aren't going to launch a frontal attack. Or is the U.S. going to pull its troops out, and the Kurds will then probably negotiate some kind of a deal with the Russians and the Assad government? And then Idlib will be isolated and eventually overrun.
Yeah. My reading is that it seems like the Trump administration really does want to get U.S. troops out of there. Is that right or not?
Well, you know, the problem is he talks out of two sides of his mouth. He's been doing that since the campaign in 2016. On the one hand, he kind of wants to come off almost like a isolationist of old, where, we don't want to waste our money on these Arabs, and we don't want to, it's costing us too much money, we want to bring our boys home. On the other hand, in practice, in every single case, he's increased the number of troops in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, and in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
Every single one of them, he said, I want to pull the troops out, and then he increases the troops. And the reason
that was going to be my next question, because there's what Trump says, and then there's things like what Jim Mattis wants, the Secretary of Defense.
The key giveaway was when the minute he took office, he appointed 3 generals to be his top men. And with some changes, that stayed the case. Either generals or these ultra right-wing neocons, like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. And you notice that he'll say one thing and then the government does something else. It's the most bizarre situation this country's ever seen. You know, he'll tweet one thing, he'll give a speech, and then all his people will hold a press conference and contradict him. And the generals,
nice if the Senate and the House would do that once in a while.
Yeah, really. The reality in Syria is the generals, at least for now, want to keep the troops in Syria.
Why?
Well, they don't like Assad, and they don't like the Russians being there, and they don't like the Iranians being there. And they see Syria as one part of a game throughout the region in competition with those powers, and particularly with the Iranians. And they know if the U.S. troops pull out, it's not like the Iranians are going to overrun northern Syria. Like I said, I think there's going to be a negotiated settlement. The Kurds aren't going to be ignored. But Iran and its allies emerge as the winners. And that's essentially the same problem in Yemen, which is the Houthis, which are an independent force, but they're backed by Iran, have been winning, or have at least not been defeated by the horrific attacks by U.S. allies. So the U.S., when you take a step back, for all the power, for all the bluster, the U.S. is on the losing end of most of these wars and conflicts in the region.
That's the way it's been going for the past 17 years. It seems like, I don't know if it would be helpful to pursue this or not, or just confuse things, but what does each of these countries that have troops in there, what are they ultimately after? What does Russia want to get out of this? They came to Assad's aid to begin with. Now they're kind of in charge as they're working their way toward the next phase of it or something. What ultimately do they want?
I think, the Russian-Syrian relations go back many years. back to the days of the Cold War when
Russia has a major base.
Russia, well, at the time, actually, it was not a major base. Now they do, but
Yeah.
it was a relatively small naval repair facility, actually. But it was a facility. But they, there's a lot of Syrians that live in Russia. I didn't know this until I started talking to
didn't know that
Syrians.
either.
Yeah. A lot of intermarriage, because back in the days of Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, he was a nationalist dictator who was aligned with the Soviet Union in the Cold War with the United States. And they received arms and training. A lot of Syrian military had gotten their training in the old Soviet Union. So there's these ties that went back. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia emerged, it didn't have time or ability to be much concerned with international affairs. It was too busy, fighting the mafia and the other democratic forces that had been unleashed in Russia. So, but once Putin had been able to kind of stabilize things from his standpoint and impose a more stringent dictatorship in Russia, he started looking around at the Middle East, and he saw the U.S. Was, on the offensive throughout the region, and so he kind of decided to draw the line with Syria, and to confront what he saw as U.S. meddling, and indeed was U.S. meddling throughout the region. They reasserted the Russians are particularly allied with the Syrian military and the secular nationalist dictatorial forces in the Assad regime. They're not particularly friendly with Iran. Obviously they're allied together, but they have their own interests separate from the Iranians, who are driven by a different ideology and a different methodology. So the Russians at this point now have put a lot into this, and that small naval base has suddenly become a very big naval base, along with a very big army base. And they have 50-year leases. And they've got extraterritoriality, which means Russians who commit crimes in Syria cannot be tried in Syrian courts. It's exactly what the United States does in Japan and Korea and all. It did in Iran, that made the Ayatollah Khamenei so famous back in the days of the Shah, because the U.S. insisted on that in Iran. Now the Russians are doing it in Syria. Yeah. So for all those out there who think Syria, Russia is the savior and has done all this great work and helping the Syrian people and blah, 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 take a look at why would they insist on extraterritoriality. Yeah. That's how imperialist powers operate. Iran, again, its ties with Syria go back many decades to the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. They have economic investments there. They did not, it's not religious. The idea, oh, well, Iran is Shia and Assad is part of a kind of group that's a branch of Shia. It's more, it's not religious.
No, it's the bank accounts.
It's the bank accounts and the military and geopolitics. Iran wants Syria as an ally, in part to be able to continue supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon next door. And arms are shipped by air, by the way. It's not a land corridor. You fly the planes from Tehran to Damascus. You truck it through Syria, over the mountains into southern the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon, and you've got allies of Iran. So it's geopolitics, economics, military motivates Iran.
U.S. wants, at least some forces in the U.S. want to stay there as a check on both of these.
Right, and initially they wanted to install a pro-U.S. regime in Syria. But they figure, sorry.
The Assad must go seems to be off the table now. We never take things off the table in this country, but I sure haven't heard anybody talking about that.
They pretty much admitted it when in the congressional hearings, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was asked how many rebel fighters have we got on our side in southern Syria. He said 5. Not 5,000, not 500, not 55. And that was after how many billions of dollars for training and wasting of taxpayers' money. That was as close as I've come to an admit of defeat by a U.S. general in a long time.
Yeah, I read something recently that I think the CIA has been spending $1 billion a year on recruiting these militias. Right.
Well, that was the rough estimate of how much all of the training and paying for all of the arms, etc.
And cost overruns.
The CIA was running it out of southern Syria, and the Pentagon was running out of northern Syria near the Turkish border. And each one was costing $1 billion.
So we've been paying $2 billion a year.
Yeah, I don't think we are now. I think they've cut it back. But at one point, the U.S. was, yes.
Yeah. Turkey, what are they looking for?
Okay, well, Turkey is initially had been buddy-buddy with Assad when it looked like the Muslim Brotherhood and other Sunni forces would overthrow Assad. They came out against him and started backing the rebels. When that didn't seem to go anywhere, they're now back on quasi-friendly terms with Assad. For those out there who think that there's some kind of consistency in anybody's foreign policy, just check out how many different sides everybody's been on in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
From Israel to Turkey, to the U.S. to the Russians, etc. The Turks now have set up military bases inside Syria. Their main concern is the Kurdish issue. The Kurds in Syria, of course, there's Kurds in Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. And Turkey, that is the largest numbers in eastern Turkey. The Kurds have a right of self-determination. They're people who were never allowed to have their own nation, going back as far as World War I. They have a very proud people. They're not Arabs, they're not Turks, they're Kurds. They're separate people with their own culture, language, and history. In Syria, the group leading that battle has explicitly called for autonomy, not for separation. They're not interested in having a separate, independent Kurdistan, at least in the foreseeable future. The Turks say, we don't believe you. We think that you're going to become independent, and we're not going to allow that to happen. That's their official argument. What it really is the Kurds in eastern Turkey are a strong, independent force opposed to Erdogan. And even with all of the repression and the arrests and the jailing of their leaders, the Kurdish political party, it's mainly Kurdish, although it draws support from other folks in Turkey, made the 10% cutoff to make it into the parliament, in the national parliament.
That's right.
This time. And they have the last couple of times where votes were held. So they are a significant political and military force in Turkey, and they're not going to go away, and the repression against the Kurds in northern Syria is not going to solve Turkey's problem with its Kurdish minority in Turkey. But that's the number one concern of the Turks, is the Kurdish issue. And if the U.S. was not there, they would probably attempt to overrun.
Have already been physically overrun.
Yeah, physically the Kurdish region, yeah.
And quickly, finally, no troops on the ground, but plenty of troops in the air. Israel, what's their goal?
Well,
and as you mentioned, they're still illegally occupying the Golan Heights. So
Israel always talks about its security and defense against attack on Israel, etc. What's really about a lot of Israel's water supply comes out of the Golan and from that region. And when they conquered the Golan in 1967 and then again in 1974, there's another war fought over it. The water supplies that go to provide water for Israel flow through Syria. That's their main reason for annexing that part of the world, of the region.
Yeah, Golan Heights, something like 80% of Israel's water comes down from there into the rivers.
And so then once you've annexed illegally somebody's territory and they're fighting to get it back, of course you're going to have a national security problem.
Yes.
Big surprise. The Israelis have not been able to resolve the issue with the Palestinians despite horrific repression. Repression and military might and annexation don't work. You've got to have a political solution. And it's true, the border area, basically the short version is the Israelis have been meddling from pretty early on in an effort to find first rebel groups that they could ally with against Assad, and now kind of recognizing the reality that Assad is going to be there for the foreseeable future, and so they're trying to get Assad's people back in control, his army back in control of the border region, so that pro-Iranian or Hezbollah or other forces don't come into that area.
Especially Iran's forces. So now Israel wants Syrian troops back on the border.
Right.
Along those lines, Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin have met something like 3 times in the last 6 months about Syria, I believe. Yes. Any idea what's cooking up there?
Yeah, it's not a secret. They basically, Israel is telling Russia, we're going to carry out these military activities, bombing inside Syria against your allies. We're not going to bomb you. So we're giving you a heads up on that, and we don't want you retaliating. We're not interested in a war with you. And so far, reluctantly or willingly, who knows exactly why, the Russians have gone along with it. Because their allies have been consistently bombed. The Israelis have bombed Syrian army forces, Hezbollah forces, and Iranian forces, and military bases and facilities, but they've not bombed Russian facilities.
Yeah.
And so the Russians have gone along with it.
Where do we go? The Russians, as I understand it, have three things they want out of Trump. First is the troops out, and they want a timetable for that, I think. They want more help with repatriating refugees. There's still 1.5 million internal refugees and over a million, or 5 million, 5 or 6 million external refugees. So they want help with that, and the whole world should be helping with that, I think. And they want help with reconstruction.
Yeah.
They can't afford it, and I don't think the U.S. has much interest in...
It should, given all the disruption the U.S. has caused. It
Yeah.
should be rebuilding Iraq and Syria, not to mention Afghanistan. But there's always untold billions, if not trillions of dollars available to make war, and zero or very little available to make peace, to reconstruct. Yes, Syria, even if it's tomorrow, all the foreign troops were out of Syria, and Syria was able to the war had ended and the rebels were defeated. Even then, Syria would have a horrific time trying to rebuild.
Yeah.
Because you look at those pictures of half of Aleppo is just flattened in the war. A number of other cities are like that. Daraa is wrecked. And Syria does not have the finances to do that kind of reconstruction. And the Russians, I think, objectively, they don't have the kind of money.
They don't either,
They're under sanctions. I mean, they should contribute something. They've been doing their share of flattening buildings, too.
Yeah.
So they should, do some rebuilding. But I think there would have to be a concerted international effort.
Let's see what's on the minds of our audience members here. If you'll hold up your hand if you have a question or comment, and wait for Crystal to arrive with the microphone. And then hold it straight up to your mouth, up here, up front. Thank you. And if you would stand up and make it easier on our camera folks, that'd be great.
Well, I was wondering how the Saudi and UAE interests in their rivalry with Iran in the region comes into all of this. And there certainly have been some strange circumstances. For instance, when Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, and you would think there would be screams of outrage from the Saudis, for instance, and the Egyptians, and we didn't hear very loud screams of outrage. So I don't really know what my question is, except that there seems to be a broad attempt on the part of the Trump administration to align forces differently in the region against Iran. And I think that serves possibly the objectives of the Saudis and the UAE more clearly than it does anybody else's.
Yes, that certainly, you've accurately described what the Trump administration is trying to do. To some extent, that was going on under Obama as well. This is not something new. And Trump is just kind of more blatant and open about it. And Obama thought it, Trump tweets it. And what happens is they're trying to drive a wedge or form a coalition against Iran that includes Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the idea is that, at least for a good chunk of the Trump administration, they think Iran is the main enemy in the region, not terrorism. Remember, Saudi Arabia was backing the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. Saudi Arabia is cooperating with the al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen. Again, if people don't believe this, you can check my articles out or do a little bit more research. But this is known. So supposedly we're fighting against a war against terrorism. What we're really doing is we're cooperating with the people backing the terrorists in order to go after what they consider to be the bigger enemy. It's a very dangerous policy, and it's going to fail. it's going to fail. They invaded Yemen. How many years has it been now? They were going to clean that up in a matter of months.
Yeah.
The war has continued to go on, and lives were lost and billions wasted.
So we're cooperating with countries that are backing terrorism to isolate a country because it's backing terrorism.
Well, that's the argument, except they're not. I mean, you have to make a distinction. And again, I've made my criticisms of Iran and its activities in the region very well known. But the people they're backing, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad government in Syria, they're not terrorists. These are people who use armed struggle. Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis consider themselves national liberation movements that use armed struggle. That's completely different from Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, which are groups who really see killing civilians as at the core of their being. They are terrorist groups. And those groups are backed by our allies, not by Iran. Iran does not back Hezbollah, does not back Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State.
Okay, question in the back row there.
Yeah, hi, thank you for this. I would like to hear your thoughts on the latest overture from Trump to Iran to negotiate, to talk, how realistic you think that might be, and in weighing Trump's ego and potentially his objective of having a new deal with his name on it versus the hawks in the government who really want to regime change, for example, in Iran.
This may be one of those few situations where Trump is actually carrying out the plans of his advisors. John Bolton, some months back, had advocated that the administration do exactly what it's doing: crack down, impose the sanctions, and then offer to negotiate. And then when Iran turns it down, say, well, look, we tried. They're the ones who won't negotiate. So this is one of those few cases where I think Bolton went to him and said, hey, you want to get another shot at the Nobel Peace Prize? offer to, hey, we're going first in Korea, then we'll go over to Iran. And Trump goes, oh yeah, Peace Prize. You can't take his offer to negotiate with Iran seriously. It's just no reasonable country, after having abrogated their agreement unilaterally. What if they sit down, they reach an agreement? What guarantee is it the next day he's not going to come up with something completely different? So the Iranians have rejected it out of hand, and I don't know any country that has taken it seriously.
I think Rouhani's, the Iranian leader, Hassan Rouhani's response to that offer was, you don't stab someone in the back, leave the body on the floor, and expect them to come negotiate.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that sums it up.
Yeah. Okay, over there in the corner. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I was surprised when you said the Iranians have to fly their weapons over Iraq to get to Syria. So maybe you could say a little bit more about Iraq. Whose side are they on? Who are they friendly with? Who are they feuding with?
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. That was true historically and true today. The government in Iraq was, of course, installed by the United States and handpicked by the United States initially. When they actually had elections that you could call something close to reasonable, the pro-Iranian parties won the elections. Of course, in 2014, the Islamic State overran much of Iraq, and there was fighting going on for a couple of years. Basically, the U.S.-trained Iraqi army collapsed. Something you don't hear much about is the Iranians sent in troops and advisors to bolster the Iraqi army while the U.S. was sending troops from the other side. And the Iraqis, at least many Iraqis, are thankful to Iran for having helped them fight the Islamic State. The Iranians have made a decision that they've made a decision that they don't want to completely dominate in Iraq at this point. To kind of exercise as much influence as they could would backfire on them. and destabilize, because then the U.S. Would pull its troops out, or there might be fighting with U.S. troops. It would destabilize the government in Baghdad and wouldn't be a benefit to anybody. Part of that is they're not going to, therefore, truck weapons through Iraq to get to Syria, to get to Lebanon. It's called a land bridge. You may have heard about that, and there's a lot of concern in Washington and in the media about, oh, Iran is going to be able to set up a land bridge. They don't need a land bridge. They've got an air and land bridge. All they have to do is fly the arms from Tehran or wherever in Iran to get them to Damascus, and then they go overland. Could they now send those arms through Iraq? I think it would be politically it would be stupid, and even militarily it might be dangerous, because all you need is one convoy to be attacked or to have something happen, and boo-hoo-hoo, you know, big international incident. So don't believe all the stuff you hear about the dangers of a land bridge.
All right, over here. Wait for the microphone.
Sorry. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about why you think Russia supported Assad initially. In Michael McFaul's book, when he and Obama were negotiating with Putin, it sounded like their interpretation was that maybe they were afraid the Sunnis in Chechnya might rebel. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, the Chechens had been rebelling long before the Syrian Civil War broke
I mean, about
out.
cause more
They've
problems
caused more
for
problems.
Putin.
You know, I believe that that's what they think, but that's this mentality that religion is the dominant force in the region and that it's Sunni versus Shia. I mean, obviously there is conflict and there is disputes, but that's not at the core of it. And by the time Russia invaded Syria, the Chechen War had pretty much been resolved. It was brutally repressed by Putin. And I was there. I mean, I went to the borders of Chechnya and I reported on that. So I saw firsthand what was going on. So it was a brutal military and political human rights violating repression. But if the folks fighting in Syria were going to come into Chechnya, they would have done it long ago, and I don't think that was a significant factor. I think it was geopolitics. That is, the Russians recognized a chance to establish, kind of give a poke in the eye to the U.S. and establish and bolster an ally in this geopolitical competition for control of the Middle East.
Kind of a foothold with the waning U.S. presence there in the wake of Iran. It was just an opportunity.
Right, and they could do it with relatively little danger to themselves. They didn't have to make a huge commitment of ground troops. I mean, Russia remembers Afghanistan as well as the United States, and that was one of the factors that led to the lack of popularity of the old Soviet Union and ultimately to its collapse. They waged an aggressive war in Afghanistan that they couldn't win.
Yeah.
And they were smart enough not to do that again in Syria. They're letting the Iranians, Hezbollah, and the Syrian army do the fighting on the ground, and Russian mercenaries. Let's not forget those folks.
Yeah. Afghanistan was kind of Russia's Vietnam, and they learned the lessons, whereas I don't think we learned our lessons.
Apparently not.
No, apparently not. Time for one more quick one, if anybody wants to try it. Okay. Be terse and succinct.
Is there a particular reason why you haven't mentioned oil pipelines, the differences between Russia and Saudi Arabia and the UAE?
No, but I'll be happy to comment on it. Looking longer term, oil pipelines and transportation of oil is always a contentious and fraught problem. So basically there's different proposed oil pipelines that the U.S. wants to use to get oil out of the region, and the Russians want to use the oil to get out of the region. The U.S. has proposed one that runs through U.S. allied countries of the region. The Russians want one that will go through Syria and end up in either through Lebanon or the Syrian part of it to get to the Mediterranean. The problem is you can't build any pipelines while there's war going on, because somebody's gonna come along and blow up your pipeline. But for sure, longer term, and that is when I talk about the economic interests of the region, those pipelines are a major concern.
Good question. We're going to have to let it go there. One thing that I'm baffled about this whole thing is, as activists, what can people here do about this? There's nothing in front of Congress on this. They probably wouldn't do anything about it anyway, this do-nothing Congress. Do we just sit around and wait for something to come up, or do you have any suggestions for us?
Well, it is difficult. I've been around, I was an activist in the Vietnam War movement, and so I'm going back 50 plus years on this stuff, yeah, and maybe some of the folks out there. And we remember that what we remember about the anti-Vietnam War movement was the huge mass demonstrations. What you don't remember is when I called a forum and 3 people showed up.
Yeah.
Or, you know, there were 2 people out at a picket line when Madame New came to visit UC Berkeley in the early 60s. She was the wife of the dictator in South Vietnam. So movements go up and down. And so at this stage, I say we need to educate ourselves. It is a very complicated situation.
That's why we're having this
This is why events like this and others to explain to people what's really going on, answer their questions.
Your book has been updated.
Yeah. And I think when the American public is going to react is when American soldiers get killed, unfortunately.
Yeah.
When that happens. Look at, was it 3 special forces soldiers were killed in Niger? And it was front page news for a number of days. Three people. And they, I think, are they playing down or otherwise minimizing the troop casualties in Syria, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. And we're seeing more American troops being killed in Afghanistan. And I think
I'm going to have to cut you off because the
I think the
clock says
situation, the people will demonstrate again and show up in numbers, in large numbers again.
Okay, good. My guest has been Reese Erlich, foreign correspondent and author of several fine books, including the forthcoming revised The Iran Agenda Today, and he'll be back in town in November with that new book. Reese, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for watching at home.